What are the possibilities when you combine slow stitching and Victorian crazy quilting? Well, they're endless. Join me as I create a colorful fabric collage, add trims and cording, and embellish it all with layers of stitch. After that, I add a lining and pockets to create a journal cover full of touchable texture. First, I'm going to create a collage with fabric, but then I change my mind and rework it. See how I work in color families and create a cohesive theme with stitch, including French knots and the lazy daisy stitch. It all results in a riot of crazy color and embellishment that make a unique book cover to enjoy every day. So grab your fabric scraps, trims, and lace and come stitch along. If you want to explore more crazy quilt inspired slow stitching, check out my other video where I create a scroll. I'll put a link in the description so you can check that out. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. In choosing the size of your base, you should make it slightly larger on all sides than the book cover. The cover of my book is 3.5 by 5 inches, and that 3.5 is doubled when I open my book up, and I also have to account for the spine. So every measurement's going to be different based on the size of the book that you're going to cover. I would take the entire measurement. The best way to determine this is to open up your book flat and make sure that your base extends on all sides past the edges of your book. I'm working on a base that is 6 1/4 by 9 1/4 inches, about 16 by 23.5 centimeters. I'm using felt for this. You could also use quilt batting or even fabric, as long as it feels soft and nice to stitch through. I'm going to start to build my collage on this base. I've chosen this piece of fabric to be the central starting point for building a collage. And in the crazy quilting style, I'm going to place it on the fabric so that it's in a diamond shape, so it's not squared up to the sides. And then I'm going to pull fabrics and build out the collage from that central piece. I'm going to audition pieces. Every piece that you add is going to inform your next choice. And what I'm also keeping in mind as I build out this collage is that I want to have irregular shapes. So I'm thinking in terms of strips of fabric, triangular shapes of fabric, and lots of uneven sides. So here's where I've got to so far with my collage. I've got this green turquoise color that I'm pulling fabrics from. I've also got this golden yellow that I'm pulling fabrics from. So I've got these two colors that are helping inform the choices that I make at this point. So now I have enough pieces of fabric that I've covered my entire base. So even though I might not be certain that this is exactly the collage that I want, I'm going to stitch it down. I'm going to attach these pieces. So I'm going to start by bringing out my applique pins, and you could use regular sewing pins for this. I'm going to pin the pieces of fabric down. And now that they're pinned, I'm going to bring out regular sewing thread and I'm going to baste everything in place. Now, one of the benefits of basting things down, whether you're using pins or thread, is that you can change your mind and you can rework one or more pieces of your collage. So now that I've stitched all of these pieces in place, I'm going to flip over my collage and trim off the edges. And that's going to help me get a better idea of the collage that I'm working with. So overall, a lot of these pieces are working. I really only have about 3 different colors going on. I have a lot of this turquoise green. I have golden yellow. I have a very small amount of shades of red or fuchsia. So at this stage, I'm still thinking that this is the collage I'm going to end up with. And so I start to think about my trims and cording. I'm bringing out a piece of lace that I'm going to place right near that central piece that I started building my collage with. I like the way that that looks. It's covering up that area of green that doesn't have any pattern on it. So I'm going to stitch that down. I'm going to tuck under the edges on that one piece on the left, and I'm going to use a matching thread to stitch that down without any visible stitching showing. So I've stitched on that piece of lace, and I'm going to step away from this to give my eye a chance to sort of reset so I can come back and see it with new eyes. So now that I've come back, I can see several things that aren't working for me. This green and turquoise piece on the right, I'm feeling like it's taking up too much space and it's too big. And I'm thinking about adding a lighter color in there. And I'm thinking about adding more fabric, different fabric, and lighter. I've pulled out this one piece of this ocean-themed fabric that has some orange and some pale turquoise. That may be something that could go there. I'm also looking on the left, and this beautiful orange-yellow color and the leaf isn't quite working. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play with this collage, and because I've basted everything down, I can snip the areas that I want to remove and just rework it. And that's going to involve bringing in some new fabrics. I'm feeling like overall this is looking too dark, so I'm bringing in some fabrics that are lighter, just testing them out and seeing what works. I feel like I want to shift from more of the red tones towards more pink tones. So I'm bringing some of those fabrics out as well. And each time you add something new, it makes you want to rework another area. So I just keep going and going. So now I'm getting closer to the collage that I want. It's a little lighter overall, a little more joyful, more of the colors that I'm wanting to see here. And in the fabrics that I've brought in, I've still got lots of leaf or floral shapes, but the colors are working better together. So now that I have this modified collage, I'm going to come in and use my sewing thread to baste my new pieces down. So here's my new collage. Let's have a look at where it was when I started and how it looks now. There's a lot more going on. I feel like the colors work better together and there's more variety. So now that I'm happy with the collage, I can start adding my trims where two fabrics meet. I've gone into my stash and I've grabbed some trims and cordings that have similar colors to my collage. And I'm just going to start playing and auditioning the cordings to see what works where. And when I see something that I really like when I put it down, I'm going to stitch that down. And that's the order I'm going to work in. I feel like it's a good idea to work from the center out, but that's not a rule. I'm just going to see what happens. I've chosen floss colors that match the fabrics that I'm using. So I'm using a few shades of blue, some pink and purple, an orange, and a golden yellow. And these are all selected directly from the colors that are in my fabric collage. I'm also going to add white floss and this spool of turquoise, which is also cotton, and one strand from that spool is equivalent to 2 strands of embroidery floss. So I'm choosing a matching colored floss to stitch down this golden yellow cording on the left. So I'm tucking it under the fabric, and then I'm going to couch down this piece. This is almost like a rope. So couching seems like a good approach here to attach this. I'm going to start at the end that's tucked under this pink fabric. I'm going to come up from the back, pull my thread through, then I'm going to hold the end of my yellow trim in place with my left thumb. I'm going to stitch around and through the end here, securing it in place. These first few stitches aren't going to be seen, so my focus is just getting it secured in place. Then I'm going to continue moving down, and this is a twisted cord, so I'm going to follow the twist of the cord and place my stitches diagonally right over top where it twists. So I'm not going through the cord, I'm going around it on both sides. You can even guide that thread to make sure that it lands right inside the crease where the twist is. And then I will just continue going around and around, working my way all the way down to the end. When I get to the end, I'm going to tuck it underneath the other piece of fabric and take several stitches to secure it, and then tuck my fabric over top of that end. So I'm liking the way that that looks. I'm going to keep going. I found some pale blue trim that I'm going to put on this small spot here. And I'm going to sew that on with a thread color that's leaning more towards the turquoise, because that's a color that I have going on in other parts. So this is going to be visible stitching. You can really do whatever you want here. Match the threads to your cording or your trim. You can contrast completely, or you can go with a slightly darker or slightly lighter shade of the trim that you're stitching down. It's good to do a little bit of everything when it comes to a crazy quilt style. So I'm coming back with this golden yellow floss, and I'm going to do some stitching in this fuchsia pink fabric. I'm going to bring those straight stitches out to highlight that cording. Along the top of this central piece, for fun, I'm bringing out this rickrack that I have. It's dark and it has metallic thread on top. It's very different. It's going to add some contrast. So I'm going to cut a piece that will cover that central piece and that fuchsia piece beside it. Seems like a good length. This is very stiff and metallic, so I'm going to use a dark thread and stitch this so it'll be mostly invisible. I'm stitching right through the rickrack, starting at one end and working my way down that zigzag. And now I'm just going to keep going. I have this off-white strip. It's a little bit shiny. I think might be nice here. I also have this yellow lace that I want to bring in somewhere, but I'm liking this shiny ivory color here. So I'm going to stitch that on. I'm going to tuck the ends under the fabric. I'm going to hide the ends wherever I can. Now I'm going to move over to the other side. I have this rat tail cording and this purple fuchsia color that's very similar to that leaf shape in the center. So I want to find a place for that. I don't think it's showing up very well against this fabric at the bottom. They're too close in color. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to bring out some pearl cotton thread, size 8. It's in a slightly darker color. I'm going to stitch right along the edge there. Now I may also add some trim later, but for now I like the way that this looks, and I'm going to keep going, adding more trim. I have this pink trim. It's nice and soft. It's fairly thick. It could work in a couple places. I think I like it up here on the left. So I'm going to stitch that on beside the blue floral piece. And then I think after that, I'm going to want to find a place for that yellow lace. So I've stitched both of those on, and this piece is coming together. More and more seams have trim on them. And I wanted to point out here that you don't have to attach all of your trims on all the edging before you start to do any kind of decorative stitching on the fabric. So I'm going to start doing some stitching right in the center on that piece of silk. I think this feels like a good time to start doing that. You can really do anything at any time with this method. I've taken that golden yellow and I've added some French knots to the center. And I've also gone up in the middle of that leaf and added some stitching lines. So because I've used French knots, I'm going to continue that theme into other areas of the piece. This time I'm choosing a dark wine color and pearl cotton size 8, and I'm going to stitch some French knots over top of this gold ribbon that I've added. I've outlined the ribbon, and now I'm going to come right onto the ribbon and add another cluster of French knots. I've jumped back and added some more trims. A small piece of orange here and some pink over here. I've added some orange at the bottom. You can see that I've stitched the end of this, and I've left enough that I can fold it under and stitch it down towards the back. This is what I did here with this orange piece. This ribbon is thin, so I was able to just tuck it under and stitch it down, and it didn't add extra bulk. But here with the blue, it's too bulky to fold back, so I've trimmed it right at the edge. And this is the same case with this dark pink. It's a thick, flat cord. And if I was to fold that towards the back, it would add more bulk than I want. So that will need to be trimmed right at the edge. And this piece down here with this rat tail cording, I'll be able to stitch to the back. So every bit of trim is going to have a different treatment in terms of finishing it off when it comes to the edge of the piece you're working on. So here I trimmed down this dark pink and I stitched right at the edge several times to keep it from fraying. And I also folded down the edges of my fabric here and added some blanket stitch. And I've done the same thing in this other corner. I've added some running stitch lines on this dark burgundy piece, and I've folded the edges around to the back and stitched them on. I've begun to move around the edges, folding under the fabric or the trim where I can, and taking the time to stitch down these edges. I've used regular sewing thread for this. Some of the edges are quite small, there's not a lot of fabric to fold under, and that's okay, I have enough to fold it all under. Now here's something I do when I've stitched on a trim that I'm not folding towards the back and stitching down, and it's the type of trim that has the tendency to fray. I use matte gel medium. This is the brand I use, Tri Art. You can also get matte gel medium from Golden brand and Liquitex. These are usually available in the painting section of an art or craft store. You could use a product like Fray Check for this. And what this does is dries clear and it keeps the ends from fraying. So I take a small paintbrush, I paint a tiny little bit right at the edge, and I allow that to dry. Once it's dry, it's permanent. And if you add a very small amount, it's not going to add an undesirable hardness. It's just going to keep the trim from fraying. So I still have a few spots where I haven't added trim where two fabrics meet, and I'm going to add those as I go along. I'm going to move back and forth between stitching on these fabrics and adding trim. I'm going to return to this central piece of fabric, this silk in this dark green with the leaf on it, and I'm going to stitch some more. So here I've begun adding straight stitches going in different directions, and I'm using that same turquoise thread that I've used in other areas of the piece, and I'm going to cover this entire area. So here it is completely stitched. It's lightened up that dark green, and it's added so much texture. I'm really happy with this result. I think I'm going to continue using this turquoise floss when I stitch in other areas of the piece. Now I'm going to stitch on that strip of fuchsia pink right beside the central piece. I've begun stitching lazy daisies. I've created several here. In case you haven't stitched a lazy daisy before, it's fairly simple, and I'm going to show how I did it. You come up right where you want the center of your flower to be, and then you go back down in the same spot. As you pull your thread, it starts to create a loop. So you don't pull it all the way through, you keep that loop, and that's going to be your petal. You come up a distance away from where you came out before, and that's going to be the size of your petal. So I'm coming out a distance away, and when you come up in the middle of that loop. So I've come up in the middle of the loop, and then I'm going to take a stitch outside of that petal to anchor it down. And that's your lazy daisy stitch. So if you stitch these around a central circle, then you can create petals for a flower, and that's what I'm doing here. And when I've finished this last flower, I'm going to stitch in the background, and I'm going to use that same color thread that I used in the central piece of fabric, and I'm going to stitch straight stitches. So here I've added these stitches, and I've almost worked my way to the top. This turquoise shows up differently than it did on the green, but it's adding unity and that same wonderful texture. I'm going to continue adding stitch details in each section. I've moved up here, stitching around these spirals, and I've used white to outline the orange swirl designs. I have also stitched in white down here, making straight lines that have highlighted the French knots that are also in white below. I've used turquoise to outline these leaf shapes on this deep pink fabric, and that's mimicking the outline of the swirls at the top. I think I may come back in with white and stitch in between these outlined areas as well. I've placed running stitches in this yellow area using both turquoise and the golden yellow colors, and I've added more French knots up here, creating a triangle shape in this deep burgundy color. I have more stitching to do on this left side and at the top on the right, and my plan is to use the same floss colors and similar stitching patterns to further unify all the colors that are going on in this crazy quilt. The two main stitches that I'm using are French knots and the seed stitch or the straight stitch. And by sticking to these simple stitches and repeating them all over the entire piece, it's going to come together in a beautiful, unified way. I've added more seed stitch and more French knots, and now I want to add another element. I have this flower trim, and the blossoms are quite big, and I think this pink one is going to fit right in with everything going on so far. I think it will look nice here at the bottom on the right, so I want to clip this one bloom off and stitch it in place. The blue flower would also match, and I could put it on the other side, and that's a good option. But I have something else in mind for this spot, so I'm going to stick with the pink blossom for now. I can always bring in the blue one later if I want. Depending on your project, this trim would also be beautiful along the edge of two fabrics, so that's an option too. In terms of placement for this pink blossom, I need to be aware where the edge of my piece is, so I don't place it too close. I also think this would look good if it overlapped and it touched two different fabrics, so I think that's what I'm going to do. I've sewn the flower in place. I used some pink floss, and I did place it on the border, and I like the way that that's looking. And I also used the same pink floss, and I stitched some Lazy Daisy petals over top of this gold ribbon. I didn't create flowers, so it's not exactly the same as the Lazy Daisy flowers in white, but it still replicates that stitch in another part of the piece, and it adds some of that pink color that's going on in a few spots as well. Keeping in mind that this will be a book cover, it's helpful to fold it in half to see how it's looking as a back and a front cover. I can take a look at the different elements, the colors, the shapes, the textures, and I can see where I'm at, and I can think about what kind of stitching and color I want to add. I still have quite a bit of stitching to do on the back cover, and seeing it folded like this is very helpful in figuring out what to do next. Another thing I know I'm going to do is add blanket stitching around the entire thing, all edges. It's going to create a border, and it's going to capture any edges of fabric that aren't folded under. I'm going to choose a bold color for this, probably the deep burgundy purple. So looking at this piece as both a whole and as two halves is something I'm going to keep doing going forward. So I've added straight stitches and some French knots on the left, or on what will be the back, and I have this triangular shape that's still unstitched. And this is where I want to add a spider web as a nod to traditional Victorian crazy quilting, where a spider or a web was often added for good luck. I'm going to use a fuchsia pink color here so the web really stands out. And to create the web, I'm going to use the blanket stitch. So I have 2 strands of floss, and I've knotted the end of my thread, and I'm going to start right up at the point at the top. I'm going to come out and take 1 stitch across that tip. And then I'm going to start the blanket stitch. I'm going to hold the thread on the left, and I'm going to take a stitch starting at the base of my previous stitch, and I'm going to come up about 1/4 of an inch above that line. And I'm going to pull my needle through, making sure to form a loop with that thread that I'm holding to the left. So there's my first stitch, and I'm going to take the next one right beside, going in at the base and coming up 1/4 inch away, and making sure that I catch the thread to create that loop. I have room here for 1 more stitch, so I'm going to do the same thing, and then I'm going to end this row by taking a stitch down to anchor my last loop. And then from underneath, I'm going to jump to the other side where I began, and I'm going to come up at the beginning of my row. I'm going to take my needle and stretch out my first stitch and anchor it in place before I do anything else. Now I'm going to come up at the top of my previous row stitch and begin making my next row of blanket stitches, always placing my needle at the edge inside the previous row. And I just keep going. When I get to the end of a row, I anchor my stitch and then I jump back to the left and I make a new row. To create the rounded shape of the web, all I have to do is alter the length of my stitches. So in the middle of a row, I'll come out further than 1/4 inch. And then near the edges, I can come out closer than 1/4 inch. And that will create that round or oval shape that I'm looking for. So here's my web so far, and it's looking good. I think I want to add 1 more row and bring it down further. And then I also want to go up to the top and stitch right up into that corner. So here it is with that extra row added. It's exactly the size I wanted. Now I'm going to add some stitching below the web. I'm going to choose a contrasting color to add texture. When I'm finished that, all the surface stitching on this Crazy Quilt inspired piece will be complete. So I added diagonal lines in that golden yellow color below the web. And now the outside of my book cover is complete. Here's my journal, and you can see how it fits perfectly with a bit of room to spare, and that will work well for making it into a slip-on cover. So before making the inside lining, let's take a look at the entire thing section by section. Here at the top, I've added seed stitches or straight stitches in turquoise, and I've also added French knots in orange. On the left of that, there's this pink fabric with leaves where I've added seed stitches in both turquoise and orange. In this pink and orange area with the swirls, I've outlined the swirls in white and I've placed turquoise stitches in the orange area. In this trim, in this off-white color, I've added French knots in turquoise, and this colorful rickrack in pink, orange, and yellow borders a flower where I've added running stitches on the petals. I've added French knots in white and running stitches in white in this small yellow area, and behind my lazy daisy flowers, I've added seed stitches in turquoise. In this central piece of fabric that was the beginning of the entire collage, I've added French knots in golden yellow and seed stitches in turquoise. I've outlined the leaf shapes in turquoise on this pink piece, and I've also added white. And right along the border with the lace, I've added golden yellow. I've added running stitches and French knots in this yellow striped area. I've added a pink blossom and a triangular grouping of French knots in a burgundy color. I also added lazy daisy stitches in pink on the gold ribbon. And on the top right, I've added seed stitches and French knots. And I've used multiple colors to outline the leaf shapes. I used white, gold, and turquoise. In this yellow area at the top, I've stitched in a deep purple fuchsia color as well as golden yellow. And on the rat tail cording in a deep fuchsia purple, I've added contrasting stitching in golden yellow. There's so many different elements going on here. One of the things that's unified it are the stitches I've used and using the same color of floss. There are French knots in this central section, in this swirly section, in this floral section at the top. I've also repeated the seed stitching in all of those sections, as well as behind the lazy daisy stitches. And in this lower area on both the turquoise and the gold, I've placed more French knots on the trims and on the fabric. So it's all these repeating elements in different areas of the piece that has brought everything together. Even though there's so many different colors, so many different textures, it all works together as one piece. Everything belongs. Folded in half, you can also see the repeating themes in both color and stitch, and all works together. The floral and leaf patterns are repeating, the French knots are repeating, and even though there's several colors, they're spaced all over the piece, keeping the eye moving and yet hinting that it all works together. So the final step in turning this into a book cover is to add a lining. I've chosen to use Batik fabric because the pattern is the same on the back and the front. There really isn't a right side and a wrong side. That means I'm going to be able to fold this fabric and create the pockets that I need to slip the cover of my journal in. So I need to cut a piece that is a little bit wider and quite a bit longer. So in creating these pockets, I want to be able to slip my journal in, but I don't want them to be so long that it's going to be difficult to slip it in or out. So if the pockets came a little less than halfway across, that would be a good size. So I'm going to cut a piece that's just a little bit wider on both the top and the bottom. So I've cut this length. It's just a little bit bigger than the width. And this was the width of the fabric that I had. I think it's about 20 inches. So it's more than I need. So I need to decide how wide I want these pockets to be. So I'm thinking somewhere between 2 and 3 inches is going to be the right size. And I want to fold them in on themselves. So whatever width I decide those pockets I want to be, I want to have double that length. Because they're going to slip in just like this. This is looking like it's too wide. Because once I get the one cover in, it's going to be too difficult to get the second one in. So I'm thinking I want it to be about 2 inches. So that would mean 4 inches on each side. I have enough fabric that I can also fold under the edges at the top and the bottom by about 1/4 inch. Could also leave these raw, especially with batik fabric, because it doesn't fray very easily. I think I want to fold this under, but either way would be fine. So I've ironed my fabric so that it's the right width that I want it to be. You can see when I place my cover on top that the width is working well. So now I just have to decide on the width of these pockets. And like I said earlier, this width is too wide. It's going to make putting my journal in too difficult. So I'm going to fold it in even more and see what length works. So I've settled on about 2 inches as the width of my pocket. So I've cut off the remaining fabric, and here folded out you can see I'm able to fold that under once. So that's 4 inches extra beyond the size of my cover, and that's going to be the perfect size for this piece. So now I'm going to place it on my cover. I have room to tuck under those edges. So I'm going to iron all this with all my edges under. This is how my book's going to fit in. So I've ironed everything and I've tucked under those edges at the top and the bottom. I've chosen a coordinating floss and I'm going to use 2 strands and I'm going to stitch all the way around. So I've taken clips and I've clipped all the way around. I'm going to start in the middle. I could use a running stitch, making sure that I grab the cover underneath. That's going to be difficult to do when I get to the pocket area where I'm working through several thicknesses of fabric. So instead of using a running stitch, I'm going to use a stab stitch where I'm going to go all the way through from the front to the back. And I'm going to wear a thimble for this because I have to push my needle through all those thicknesses. So I'm pushing the needle all the way through to the front and I'm pulling it through. Now that means that this is going to show on the front. But I'm not worried about that because there's so much going on the front and these are going to be very small stitches that it's not going to show, or if it does show, it's not going to detract from the look of the entire piece. So I'm going to stitch this way all the way around. So I've completed the stitching. I've worked my way around the entire piece. If you look really closely, you can see some of those stitches in that light blue, but really it doesn't show. So now I'm going to get my journal and I'm going to slip it inside those pockets. So I'm going to take the front cover and slip it in. That first one's easy. And now the second one, this has an elastic on it. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to tuck that into that pocket as well. And I just need to stretch that fabric over my cover, slide it on, and there we are. That's a perfect fit. You can see that batik, that light blue, showing through, and that looks great. There's the spine, looks great on the front, looks great on the back. It's fitting really well. I'll be able to open this up and use this journal. I can also take it out if I want, but I'm also able to work with it on, which is great. And there we have it. Thank you so much for joining me on this crazy stitched project. I hope you're inspired to dive into the world of embellishment and experimentation and make your own book cover. Until next time, happy stitching.